300 warriors, a blood-red cape, an impossible last stand. You know the story. But what if nearly everything you think you know about Sparta is wrong? What if I told you that the Spartans weren't professional soldiers, that they produced almost no great literature or art, that their famous equality only applied to a tiny elite, while the vast majority of people in Sparta lived as brutalized slaves, and that their vaunted military reputation was built almost entirely on one battle and centuries of propaganda? Today, we're tearing down the Spartan myth and facing the uncomfortable truth about one of history's most misunderstood societies, the Spartan mirage. Here's the problem with studying ancient Sparta. The Spartans barely wrote anything themselves. Almost everything we know comes from outsiders, mostly wealthy Athenian philosophers like Xenophon and Plutarch, writing centuries after Sparta's peak. These weren't objective historians. They were aristocrats who hated Athenian democracy and saw Sparta as the perfect counterexample, a stable oligarchy where the right people stayed in power. Xenophon was literally friends with one of the Spartan kings. Plutarch wrote about Sparta 470 years after its golden age, when it was nothing more than a tourist attraction under Roman rule. Modern scholars call this distorted view the Spartan mirage, a fantasy version of Sparta that never truly existed. It's like learning about America only from political propaganda posters. And somehow Hollywood, video games, and fitness brands have kept this mirage alive for the 21st century. The brutal reality of the agoge. Let's start with the agoge, Sparta's infamous education system. Movies like 300 show it as a badass training program that forges elite warriors. The reality? Modern historians compare it directly to systems used today to indoctrinate child soldiers and terrorists. At age 7, Spartan boys were ripped from their families and placed in groups under adult supervision. They were deliberately underfed, not to make them tough, but to force them to steal, then beaten savagely if caught. Older boys were encouraged to beat younger ones. Annual ritual whippings at the altar of Artemis were so severe that Plutarch personally witnessed boys die from them. At age 12, these children entered relationships with adult men in their 20s. While one ancient source tried to deny the sexual nature of these relationships, other sources, and the cultural reputation Sparta had in antiquity, tell a different story. We're talking about 12-year-old boys with essentially no power to refuse adult sponsors, who controlled their future citizenship. And here's the darkest part. The graduation ceremony wasn't slaying a wolf like in the movies. Real Spartan graduates of the Crypteia stalked the countryside at night, murdering enslaved people called helots, unarmed, untrained civilians to terrorize the population into submission. This final act of violence served the same purpose as in modern child soldier groups, an irreversible act that bound them to the system forever. The agoge wasn't producing educated citizens. It was producing traumatized, conformist men conditioned to violence through systematic abuse. The survivors naturally defended it, because accepting the truth would mean confronting what they'd endured and perpetuated. The myth of Spartan military superiority. So surely all this horror produced the greatest warriors in history, right? Not exactly. Before Thermopylae in 480 BC, nobody thought Spartans were special. They were powerful because Sparta had about 8,000 citizens, making them one of the largest city-states, not because they were individually superior. One ancient source even ranked them behind Argive warriors, saying Sparta was mainly known for having the best women. Then came Thermopylae. 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas made a suicidal last stand against the Persian army. Except Thebans and Thespians also fought to the death there. The terrain did most of the work. Any Greek force could have held that pass. But Sparta controlled the narrative, and suddenly they were legendary warriors.
Then came Thermopylae. 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas made a suicidal last stand against the Persian army. Except Thebans and Thespians also fought to the death there. The terrain did most of the work. Any Greek force could have held that pass. But Sparta controlled the narrative, and suddenly they were legendary warriors. Here's the thing. Ancient sources can't name any other example of Spartans fighting to the death like that. When Spartans surrendered at Sphacteria in 425 BC, it shocked the Greek world because their entire reputation rested on one battle. The truth is, Spartans weren't trained to fight. There's zero evidence for weapons training in the Agagi, zero evidence of formation drill for boys. They learned to read, write, dance, and recite poetry, the typical education of Greek aristocrats. They weren't soldiers. They were wealthy landowners living off slave labor who fought as a civic duty. What Spartans actually excelled at was organization. Unlike other Greek armies, Spartans wore uniform equipment and moved in coordinated formations. They had supply officers, camp guards, and scouts, basic military logistics that others lacked. Most importantly, they had formation drill, subdivided units, officers at multiple levels, marching in step to flute music. This sounds basic, but other Greeks didn't do it. They charged into battle running and screaming. Spartans advanced slowly in perfect formation, which was absolutely terrifying. This tactical superiority let them win pitched battles for 150 years. But notice what's missing. They never developed effective light infantry. Their cavalry was notoriously worthless until they hired mercenaries. They dominated one specific type of warfare, the hoplite phalanx, because their rigid social system made it ideologically impossible to create a mounted elite. Everyone had to be equal, which actually stifled military innovation. And that brings us to Spartan equality, perhaps the biggest myth of all. Sparta wasn't a nation of warriors. It was a tiny aristocratic elite, maybe 8,000 full citizens at peak, ruling over a massive enslaved population called helots, who actually worked the land. These helots outnumbered citizens by at least 7-1, possibly much more. The Spartans lived in constant terror of helot rebellion, which explains the Crypteia's murder squads. Below the helots were the perioeci, free but non-citizen Greeks. And even among citizens, there were second-class Spartans who'd lost status. The famous equality only applied to a microscopic elite. And even then, wealth inequality was massive.